I have sworn against using phones. And I recently was working on something where I had to use a phone. At first, I was really angry about it because I was like, why is this so good? But I have the professional cameras and I have these tools that are dedicated for photography. And then I had this kind of like liberating thought. Wait a second. Who gives a shit? Like, it's just a tool.
Okay, so welcome back everybody to a new episode of Eyeshot 50mm. And today we're sitting down with Mark Abramson. Mark Abramson looks at the world from inside out. His photojournalist work from the New York Times, the Time, the Washington Post gives us a sense of the world that it's both political, social, but also deeply, deeply human. He also reminds us that reportage can still be an act of empathy, but even more an act of resistance. So thank you, Mark, for being with us. And it's such a pleasure to see you again, truly. So thank you.
Thank you guys. It's such a pleasure to see you, and I've, known you guys for a few years, and it's been such a wonderful to get to know you, and it's awesome to finally be working on this book together. And yeah, I'm so happy to be here. I feel really honored. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for being with us today. And before we all get started, I want to leave a small message to all of our viewers to keep liking, keep commenting, keep subscribing, because by supporting us, you're supporting independent street photography, independent publishing, independent art, and mainly in Italy, arts and craftsmanship. So welcome, Mark, to this episode of Eyeshot 50mm, and we're going to have a great time together.
So excited.
Nice. Mark, so let's dive in immediately. And the very first question that I have for you is, who is Mark Abramson according to Mark Abramson?
Dumping me already.
Exactly. The toughest one.
The toughest one. Wow. I mean, I think it's something that's interesting because I think that we become our work, and I'm actually figuring out all the time who Mark Abramson is in relation to his work, and it's a constant dive into how do you pull apart oneself from the work, if that makes any sense. I think when you get very close to the work and you're constantly observing and witnessing and seeing, you sometimes lose maybe yourself in the work. So I'm constantly trying to figure out who I am in relation to the world and to the work and outside of work as well. I mean, that's the I guess the philosophical answer. But I mean, on a very simple level, I mean, I'm someone who deeply loves photography and is inspired by, the world around me, and I'm someone that is constantly trying to, I think, discover the world through a frame, and through that maybe finding myself as well.
Okay. You are now based between Los Angeles and New York, but your story starts a little further, far from these places, moving from the Soviet Union to the United States. It's a migration journey, if I may say that. How do you think your journey and your background as a migrant in that sense has shaped your vision and the way you see the world, and consequently the way you shoot the world?
I mean, I see photography as a sense of adventure in a lot of ways, and it's you're constantly moving around. For me, I come from a family that originally came from the Soviet Union, moving through Europe to the U.S. I moved around a lot as a kid, and eventually to the U.S. with my mom. And while we moved all those years, it was constantly reimagining what is home, in a sense. And I don't think I ever, growing up, felt like I fit in anywhere. I was constantly moving from place to place, never feeling quite settled. And I think that in some ways inspired later on when I found photography at around 20 years old, this sense of, really for me, it was, if I'm being totally honest, like I never felt like a sense of place. And when I picked up a camera, it was the first time where I felt okay to feel, in a sense, at home.
Okay, and do you remember your very first photographic memory? Your first camera, your first shot? How did you feel? How did it make you feel? What was it?
I think I do actually remember one of my first pictures. It was, funny enough, I think I'd never picked up a camera before then, and I was traveling. I believe it was in Spain. Yes, it was in a place called Toledo. Yeah. Which is, I lived south of there as a kid, and I returned as already like becoming an adult, and I was seeing a piece of light in an alleyway, and it was a mom and a son walking in this like piece of light, and I snapped this photo with, it was a Canon, it was like a power shot. Yeah, it was this little power shot that my brother gave me. He gave me this camera and an AE1, it's a film camera, as kind of almost like a joke, like, oh, go take pictures while you're traveling. I was back in Europe. I was studying in a university in Madrid at the time, and I never imagined that would turn into like a life with cameras. But at the time, I was just kind of experimenting, looking around, and yeah, I remember snapping this photo of this mom and the son holding hands, which was yeah, I think the first memory of like a moment with a camera. Yeah, that I snapped.
Because the journey to become a photojournalist, a affirmed photographer in that sense, do you remember the moment where you kind of maybe mentally and also professionally switched from being an emerging photographer to recognize documentarian in a way?
I guess I'll answer the question in like in a way that I remember at least I remember the moment where I became obsessed with photography, when it started to become something that I wanted to just pursue. And I remember that was after that, I was traveling for about a year in Europe, found this connection with the camera. And I remember coming back to Washington, D.C., where I was studying to go to school. I was finishing up school, and I remember I was working on a project um, that had to do with folks living on the street in DC. And I had been in school for sort of basic journalism, like writing and, telling stories that way. And I remember when I brought the camera to that project, that school project, and I got to spend time with the folks that I'd been already developing like time with over many months. Having that camera with me was the first time that I felt a difference in being able to connect with them in a way that I hadn't before. And that was kind of the switch, and it kind of ignited this new passion, and it ignited this sense of feeling like I had permission to be there. The camera became like a permission to be with people, and then everything just kind of took off from there. Like from there, I started working on other projects, and I got really, really blessed, really lucky. I I think a lot of people, well, I don't know. Some people maybe find photography and they explore for a while with the camera. For me, things quickly changed in the sense of career. I was also trying to figure out a career path, and I got really lucky because I ended up in an internship at a major newsroom paper in DC. It was the Washington Post. I had really honestly no business being there. I didn't have a portfolio, but I had somebody that took a chance on me. And the the uniqueness of the situation for me was that I got to learn while being on the job. So like newsrooms quickly became like a breeding ground for me for creativity and for figuring out how to ignite this passion, but also to actually try to find like a way forward as a career. And I ended up staying there for almost a year, and then went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and worked at a paper for about half a year. Also did an internship. So I was lucky because internships were really a thing. It almost feels like they're a thing of the past now. There's less and less. Yeah. So I was really, really fortunate, really lucky to have these opportunities to, work on the creative part, but also learning and entering this career that I didn't quite understand where it would take me or what it was. And I just kind of went with it. I just kind of jumped in it and never looked back.
Okay, I would like to follow up on something you said earlier about the rapport you build with your subjects. So when you build a rapport with your subject, do you involve them in the process of image making, or is it something that you want full ownership of?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, if I'm working with somebody over a period of time, I feel like it becomes naturally a collaboration because you're talking about the images, you're talking about their life, they're seeing what you're doing, Um, I mean, eventually in the process, you kind of become invisible. That's the hope, a fly on the wall, and you want to become. Somebody asked me like, "Oh, if you had a superpower, what would you want?" Somebody would answer, "Oh, I want to fly like Superman," or "I want to, what is another superhero power? Levitating. I don't know. Evaporating. Uh, my like if I had a superpower, if I could have one superpower, it'd be to like literally like just be invisible. And I think that's when the beautiful moments, the really natural moments happen. It is a collaboration because they are allowing you to be there.
Okay, okay. And another thing I would like to ask you is when you're editing, so when you present a project, how do you choose what to keep and what to leave out?
Oof. Oh, that's a tough one. I've always been, I feel like, better at the photography part than the editing. I need a lot of help when it comes to editing. I mean, it depends. Like, I guess, do you mean in general, or do you mean on assignment, or it's a personal project?
The difference in the editing work between personal projects and assignments.
Okay. Well, often when you're doing assignment work, especially like daily work, you have to edit quickly, right? Because you have to turn around images really quickly to your editors to make the paper or to make the story online. So you just have to make a gut check, I feel like, and you're just going through one pass and then second pass, and you're starring and color labeling, and that's something I've had to develop. Always struggled with that, and I feel like I've gotten better with that, just making gut decisions. I feel like it's like a balance between verbs and adjectives. It's like finding images that say something, that are saying something. It's almost like a description, right? You need a balance of images that kind of give you a sense of like who, what, where, why, when. And then there's images that are adjectives, feeling photos. And so finding the balance between those, I really want to often include more adjectives, but when you're working on an assignment, often you need verbs because there needs to be something to go along with the words that maybe a reporter is writing. It's a balance between the two. But when it comes to projects, that's a whole nother question. Like I feel like with editing for projects or personal work, that takes a lot of time. I feel like I struggle more with that because often with assignments, you're editing, you're handing it in, you're moving on to the next story, right? You're moving on to the next, or the next day, or the next. You have to put it aside and move on to the next set. With personal work, it's like it's more difficult because it's maybe closer to you. You almost feel too close to the work. I feel like with personal work, I actually need a lot of outside help from people that I trust to help me see what I can't see, maybe.
Maybe that emotional attachment that a photographer has in personal project, sometimes it's a disadvantage, to the stories you're telling. Sorry to interject.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Actually, I wanted to follow up from this topic because I wanted to ask you, has there ever been a project that spilled into your personal life, and how so?
It's happened with different projects. I mean, it's only natural. We're human, right? I remember some years ago, it was like 2018. I wasn't on assignment initially. I did some assignment work while on it, but I was self-initialized in the sense that I wanted to go follow this caravan that was coming up from Honduras and going to Tijuana, or eventually ended up in Tijuana. It was a group of something like 6,000 migrants that were making the trek to try to come to the US. And it was absolutely incredible trip in the sense that I got to witness like this mass of people making this trip up in this huge group. And, I got to meet, while I was photographing sort of these general scenes, I was also meeting people on the way. And eventually, couple boys that were cousins, they ended up jumping into the U.S. to seek asylum. They were underage, and they were minors, and then they were reunited with some family that was in Florida. And I was like following up with them to try to maybe work on some more documentation of their lives and how they would maybe be working here or assimilate wherever their lives took them. And I remember, there was like a spillover into my personal life in the sense that it was becoming more than documentation, because they were looking for answers. They didn't know what to do in moments. They wanted, for example, they needed somebody to sponsor them. I, as a documentarian, I can't do that, right? I can't get involved in that kind of way, but it was spilling over in the sense, and I was trying to figure out the balance between like just being a human and also doing this work. And to help them or to give them some sense of direction, I told them about somebody that, from a church that maybe be able to help. And I directed them there. And that felt like a way to give them maybe some guidance in that moment. But because of that, I pulled back, and I eventually just left the project alone and stopped working on it because I felt like I was too close to it. And it felt like maybe my role in that situation was just to give them some direction and give them just like a help, and to step away with my camera and not work in that way. So sometimes maybe our camera leads us for a reason to do other kind of work.
Okay, thank you for sharing. Last one for me for this section, so we can switch gears in a bit.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, have you ever gone through such a deep crisis that forced you to reinvent yourself artistically or professionally? Something that happened while you were working specifically?
Now that I think about it, I mean, I remember in 2016 there was there was the presidential campaigns where Donald Trump was running the first time. And it was this phenomenon, this new moment, right? And I started photographing it on my own, going to these campaign rallies, going to these states where he was running, and I was having a deep crisis because I felt like I was just one of so many photographers trying to cover this. I didn't know what my place was or why I was there, right? It was almost like I was just there because I felt like I had to be because everybody else is, And that internal crisis turned into like an artistic, I guess, jump for me. This is a jumping off point. It kind of switched everything for me in that moment where I realized, wow, I don't have to do things the way maybe everybody else is. While I respect what they do, because there's so many amazing, photographers, photojournalists like covering these issues, it led me to kind of go inwards, and I started this project. Some of that work might be in the book, as we're editing. It's from this project I started, Two-Face, which is these in-camera multiple exposures that I started photographing around the campaigns, and I spent a year making those, and it almost became like a conceptual project around this very newsworthy, timely period. Yeah, that was like an internal crisis. Man, it turned it into something that was a new creative juice, a new way to look at something that I had in a way that I had never created before.
I want to still stay on the topic of reportage and being a photojournalist. And I wanted to ask you, Mark, how do you actually start if you have no contacts, no big budgets? How would you explain to someone that wants to be a photojournalist or do reportage? How does someone start? We know how you started. You explained it to us a little earlier. How would you advise someone to start off this career path they might want to start?
I wouldn't. No, I'm just kidding.
No.
I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding. I say that jokingly because it is really tough right now. Like I've spoken at in colleagues like classes before, and people ask about, the business of photojournalism, photography, and it's in a really tough place I feel really blessed, really lucky because I had a chance to work in internships that led to a freelance career, and I was generating enough freelance assignments to then be able to take that and invest in my own projects that were of interest to me, and sometimes resell them or run them places. Just kind of has worked. I've been really, really lucky to do reportage work. But nowadays it's really tough when people are starting out, because journalism I've seen shrink a lot in terms of like, it's interesting because I feel like now more than ever you need photojournalism, right? In the face of everything happening in the world and AI and disinformation, it's actually more important to have this human touch, right? And this like the realness, but actually there's like less opportunities for professional photojournalists in a freelance sense because there's less places to have the work run. Budgets have been affected a lot. It's a struggle. Sorry, everything I'm saying is kind of negative. I'm just being real. It's tough. I think this is going to sound cliche, but you have to just have to know you're going to get into it not for money or for, you know, because or stability. It has to come from a sense of passion and I think mission, and you have to be ready to kind of be obsessed with these stories, and go after them and give your all your time to them. You don't really have a normal life for a while, whatever normal means.
That would have followed actually my next question, which would be, what do you think then it's the toughest part of being a reporter? Like the loneliness, the risk, the instability, as you were saying before. What do you think is the toughest part for you, at least?
Toughest part is after you're done with a project or the in between when you're not working.
Why so?
I think because when you're working on a story or coverage, news coverage, all your senses are firing, the smells, the sights, the sounds, and then to come home and be in the quiet is uncomfortable, can be uncomfortable.
Have you ever then, relating to this, have you ever turned down an assignment for personal or ethical reason in a certain way that you felt like, or to protect also, I guess, your vision as a photographer too? That could also be a reason to turn down an assignment. Because sometimes there is maybe this thought that photojournalists or photographers that do reportage always have, if they're on assignments, they always have to get the assignment done legit. So have you ever turned down anything for ethical reasons or to protect your vision?
I mean, I don't know if it was to protect my vision, but it was to protect maybe for a few reasons. I was asked if I wanted to go to Ukraine, and I declined. It was the first time I ever maybe declined something. One was because I felt I was seeing colleagues getting hurt, and I didn't, and I felt like it was like an internal boundary. Like I personally, that was my boundary. Like in that moment, like I did not want to go to a frontline war. I felt like I've gone to a lot of different situations over the years, and that was kind of a line. And I feel like when there's a story that nobody else is working on, it's like almost imperative that you go. But when everybody's there, I didn't want to. It's amazing that so many people from across the world went and that are still working there. But I didn't feel like it was my place to go, even though I speak, the language and have some connection to the region with my family. Like I didn't feel my roots are in that region. I still felt it wasn't for me because there were so many people working there. And what was my question in my mind was like, what am I going to add by parachuting in? Why am I going? Why would I want to go and add to this gigantic press pool doing this very important work? But I just didn't feel right. It didn't sit in my gut. And so I decided against it and instead felt like something closer to home was more important. There were Ukrainians coming through. Now that I live in California, I'm close to the border. To this part of the border, there was Ukrainians coming, seeking refuge in the U.S. through the U.S.-Mexico border. And I was able to work in Tijuana and use my language skills with Spanish and Russian, and was able to make something that I felt like was closer to home and maybe where others weren't looking.
Okay. And following
I hope that answered your question.
yes, it did. It did. It definitely did. So this next question still relates to the job you're doing and the kind of role you have. So do you think that can a photographer still make a living from being a documentary photographer and doing a reportage? Or do you think it needs a broader strategy, like fine arts exhibitions or other sources?
I don't think it's possible to only make a living from just reportage. I mean, you can, but it's very it's bare minimum in a sense. It's and I'm very lucky because I get to do a lot of assignment work doing reportage, and ultimately it's still never enough. And so I think you have to diversify within photography and do other kinds of work. I've seen a lot of people that I really respect start to do that, and it actually is maybe can be very fulfilling because it allows for a little more freedom to do the reportage work that you really care about by giving yourself some space and some freedom. Yeah, but I think purely just from it, very difficult unless you like live some sort of bare minimum. Like I don't know how one does that with a family nowadays. I don't have kids or anything, but like I think it's very difficult. If obviously if you're staff, right, at a publication, that's different, right? You have a salary. I've always been a freelancer for the last 15 years, independent, but those staff positions are, at least in America, fewer and far between.
Okay. Okay. Very last question for this section. And I wanted to ask you, do you think this is a little philosophical, I guess? Do you think photography can actually change things the way you do it, or photography also in general? Or is it more about bearing witness rather than taking actions?
I used to think that it could make changes, and I still think it can in certain situations, but I think the latter. It's more about bearing witness. I think it's harder to make changes nowadays when we're so flooded with imagery, moving and still. It's not like the days of maybe, Vietnam, where you had certain images that were seared into people's minds. They appeared on front pages, and it was the talk of everything. It changed those kind of images. I feel like changed the course of culture and the relationship to war, and to it changed policies. I mean, I still see images doing that today, but I feel like less so because we're so inundated with images, and it's like because we're so flooded, we see images and then we move on to the next ones really quickly. And now with disinformation, we're flooded with that too. I think it's harder. I do feel like it's the latter, the bearing witness.
I would like to follow up some more on photojournalism because it's a topic we are very, very invested in. And in particular, I would like to touch on the topic of censorship because Italy has shifted to the 14th place out of 108 countries in the world in the freedom of the press list. So it's very tough out there. So I wanted to ask you, have you ever been censored, or have you ever self-censored to protect yourself?
I mean, I feel like, I don't know. I don't think I've self-censored. I don't know if it's censorship or it's protecting. Like over the last few years, like with different administrations coming into power here, it's become, in certain periods of time, it's more difficult to cover, let's say, stories about immigration, right? You have to make certain choices around, do you photograph someone anonymously to protect them, because maybe of their status issues, right? I don't know if that's a censorship issue or like a that might be a decision that you come up with an editor because it's to protect them. In terms of like censorship itself, I mean, I feel like, I don't know if it's censorship or, well, I mean, when you're covering, let's say, politics, like sometimes you're being directed in this way when you should be here, and you're I don't know if you're being censored, but you're being told what the image is, in a sense, right? When you're covering political campaigns, they want you to see a certain image, right, of the situation. So I don't know if that's censorship or that's just like it's optics.
Okay, thank you. And another thing I wanted to ask about this topic is that you recently covered some very intense moments, such as the LA wildfires or the protests against mass deportation, and you've also gotten hurt while on the job. And I wanted to ask, what's the hardest, toughest kind of tension to portray in photography? What's the most difficult, tense situation to properly cover, both technically, because how do you shoot amidst the chaos, and even choosing which moments are the best in terms of telling the story of what's happening, especially amongst chaotic situations like the ones I've described?
It's interesting because you're asking about censorship. And something that's really amazing here in California is that we actually, on a state level, have protections as press to go cover natural disasters and fires. There's actually like law and language around allowing press to go behind emergency lines. And that's what gives us the access to going so close to these fires, for example. So to answer your censorship question, there's actually there's actually no censorship in a sense covering fires here. You get to work really up close, but because of that, you also have to really respect the situation and work safely, because if you cause issues, what if protocols become, are changed down the line because they deem it no longer safe for press to work in those kind of situations. So you really have to respect the danger, and be really careful and make sound decisions. That to answer your so that was kind of going back to the censorship part. To going to your last question, that was a really tough situation because it was not just thinking about photography, but it's thinking about safety and safety gear. Often when you're just photographing in maybe a normal situation, you're thinking about your camera and your gear. Here you're thinking of covering a natural disaster, a fire like that. You're thinking about not just your camera, but you're thinking about your lungs and you're thinking about the respirator you're using, and you're thinking about, your exposure time in the area. You're thinking about, your car, you're thinking about all this other gear. You're thinking about the clothes you wear, the fire retardant gear. It's a whole other set of problems. When you're wearing these huge respirators, you're thinking about, you have to shift in how you work. Right? It's not normal viewfinder to your eye. It's, you have to get creative. You have to think about, the footwear, and then I guess to answer the other part of your question around the tension, I felt like with the protests that I was covering this year in LA that were related to, people protesting immigration raids, things of that nature. That was tense because on certain days there were a lot of people, and on other days it was more press and police than protesters. And so as a photojournalist, you're not just making images, you have to inform people about what's going on. And I think often there's a saying, it's called, when it bleeds, it leads, right? Like, it's very easy to sensationalize situations, right? And what may be just happening on one block in LA or whatever other city, it's very easy to make it look like the entire city's on fire, right? And every mass chaos, right? We have to be very careful about how we portray. And I think that when you're doing reportage and you're doing photojournalism, like, you have to think about the image, right? That's happening, and it's the story, right? It's very easy to only focus on the tension that's happening, right? And to try to encapsulate that in the pictures. But I think the hard part is also then to take a step back and show what's happening around, right? Because you want people to understand also a sense of place. Like, it might be really tense in this one place, but what is happening outside of that? Do you step back and show all the cameras and all the press? And it's not just about the moment. It's also about like transmitting information and showing what else is going on and how this situation is set up. And that I think speaks to optics.
Okay, last one for me before we switch gears. I wanted to ask you, now that we said all this, what's the most misunderstood part of being a photojournalist?
I think the most misunderstood part is that photojournalism is just taking pictures. It's like 20%, if that, of the job. Maybe. It's photojournalism is like maybe 20% taking pictures, and the rest is like research, access building, editing, building relationships with subjects, working with editors, grant writing, applying for funding. It's everything else that in some ways when you get to the actual picture part, it almost sweetens it, because you're like, wow, I'm actually here taking the picture now, and I'm actually doing the thing. But so many situations I've had like especially longer term projects and stories, or longer term assignments, features, where the access was really hard to something. I remember I was working on a piece in Florida a few years ago. It had to do with there was a collapse on a building that killed 98 people. Tragically, it was a horrible situation. It was this residential building. It got so much attention, and I thought I would be there for maybe a couple weeks. I ended up leaving LA for like 6 weeks to work there. And within those 6 weeks, like maybe only, I don't know, 10 days, 14 days were of actual real solid photography. The rest was like building relationships with the people that were, uh, excavating and trying to find survivors, which tragically there weren't. It was, working behind the scenes with the people that were putting them to rest, with getting access to the families, with faith leaders. It's a very particular community that I had some access to, but I had to build deeper access. And yeah, such a small portion was actually making the photographs. It was like building the relationships and having time with folks and explaining why it was important for me to be there, and getting their permission. And then, having these conversations with the reporter and contributing reporting, and also having, conversations around sensitivity and the editing process. So I think that's what's misunderstood, is that it's just, oh, you're just photographing all the time.
Thank you for sharing.
And that's not really the case. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you, Mark. I still want to stay on the topic of working for big media outlets, news outlets. You have worked for quite big names out there. And my question would be, when you're working for these outlets, do you feel free to tell the stories your own way, or are you more tied to, let's say, an editorial line that you need or you have to follow?
When you're a photographer working on assignment for, let's say, a major publication, sometimes you're not an author. Sometimes you're just providing a service. And that's the truth. It's like, there's a lot of stories running, and they just need pictures to run with art, they call it art, to run with the words, and sometimes you just don't have things move so quickly. Sometimes you don't have the time to really put your touch on it. Meaning you might not be able to spend time with people because the story needs to run quickly, and you might just be able to do a portrait, and then you have to move on. And that's why the times when you get to like put your authorship and spend more time with people, or spend more time with a subject, right? Or spend more time with a theme over a longer period of time, where you get that freedom, you get to really cherish those times, with the fires, for example, since we were on that topic. Like, it was very quickly, very fast news coverage. Like it was the fastest kind of news coverage I've almost ever been on. It was like feeding a beast, right? Because people wanted to know information, right? It was in some moments speed over quality. By quality, I mean like, you might want to spend some more time in a certain situation as you're working, but you just have to go back to your car and transmit it via the, Starlink, the satellite. But what was also amazing is that when you develop a relationship with certain publications or editors that you work with, which I've had the privilege of doing, like they trust you, right? Hopefully, and they give you the freedom to then spend more time. And so I felt like while it was moving very quickly, I spent many weeks working on the aftermath, and they gave me the freedom to make pictures, make adjectives, going back to verbs and adjectives, like yeah. Um, and so, and how those pictures are being used, ultimately, I'm just a freelancer, right? I can only do so much. You hand the best work you can in, right? A balanced report, and you have a take, right? You have a selection of images you're sending in, and you send in the verbs, the adjectives. You're sending in a wide array of different kinds of moments, and hopefully you have conversations around certain choices. But ultimately, it's in those kinds of situations, it's not always it's not up to you what gets chosen.
So, would you agree that visual journalism is, in a way, losing its depth under the speed of publishing or the digital pressure, let's say?
I don't think it's losing its depth. I think it's just changing. I think we're all just trying to figure out a balance. I still think you can make really in-depth work in a speedy situation, but you just have to work harder. You have to work harder. You have to be really on your toes. You have to, in those situations, be like, okay, what images do I need that cover the situation? And then how do I take a step back and think about what images I care about? And it's interesting I remember before the interview, I think you had asked me like tips for people starting out. And it's like when you're starting out and if you're working in photojournalism, I think it's important to just keep in mind, like, remember images that, that are important to transmit and hand in, that are going to just sort of like satisfy the basic, like, you need images that are just cover your bases. And then don't forget about like making pictures that are important to you. And it's funny because this book that we're working on, I feel like a lot of those images are those images. Like some of the work is personal, from personal projects, but some of the pictures in the book are from assignments. But those pictures are some of the more afterthoughts.
And when it comes to commissioned photojournalism, how do you pick your projects? Like, is it a personal urgency, an opportunity, or just pure instinct?
Well, sometimes you're being called to because you're available, right? And there's a reporter that's working on a story and they need pictures to go with those words. Other times it's personal urgency. This year, there's not as much activity on the border, for example. So I've, out of personal urgency, like, been interested in working on stories more within the country, deeper in the country, around stories about what's happening with deportations and maybe ICE and raids. Or, I mean, there's also this, the long-term work in New York that I've been doing, that we've talked about, the work about the Hasidic communities of New York, that's a whole other separate topic, but I've been working on for over a decade now. But that's very personal work that has nothing to do with anything newsworthy or timely. It's just a personal drive and a personal connection to those stories and to that photography. Yeah, so I think, but going back to your question, I think it's when you're working as a photojournalist, it's a balance between like taking on certain stories and assignments that uh, you're providing a service for, right? And that is important to the publication. And then there's other stories that maybe you're pitching, that you're bringing to the table, that are more of a come from you, and then they hopefully sign on. And hopefully for both, you can have a personal touch. But often I find that it's the projects that I bring where I can have some time to work on and that they sign on to, that they're interested in, that's where there's more of an authorship that happens.
Okay, so to conclude, my last question would be, after everything, after all we've said so far, what still keeps you behind the camera?
Obsession.
Obsession. Love that. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that's a very, very valid
Statement.
observation.
Yeah, total obsession, wanting to get it right, whatever that means, which can actually be creatively stifling. But it's just it's obsessing about the work, and yeah, that's the best way I can put it.
That's
Yeah.
fair.
Absolutely.
Totally fair.
You thought we were switching gears, but we're still staying on the topic because we are obsessed with photojournalism as a concept and journalism because we both have a background in journalism. That's why we want to know how it works overseas.
I mean, you guys are definitely obsessed. I love it. I mean, you can see it in the work that you guys put out there. The choices you make, the design you make, I knew that from the moment, I started seeing Eyeshot out there in the world in like 2018. I saw an obsession on so many levels, and it's beautiful to have seen Eyeshot evolve too, because I think when I first started becoming obsessed with Eyeshot and the work you guys are doing, I saw a lot of street photography, and it's been amazing to see sort of alchemy happening, and seeing like you guys bring in more documentary and journalism work, and seeing the two kind of melt, and really they are the same in a sense. I mean, it's all just visual language and photography, but yeah, it's the evolution of seeing where Eyeshot's been going, and also in ways that, in elements that I personally have no touch I'm not in touch with, which is the design and the way you present it, and it's a beautiful. What you're doing is so beautiful, because there's not a lot of places, I think, in the world that are obsessed in the way you are.
I love this obsession word.
Yeah.
It's just like a thread.
Yeah, it's a
Love
running
it.
theme.
Thank you, Mark. Truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Okay, just wanted to go back to the question a bit. And I wanted to ask you, in a world where everyone can be a documentarian with just their phone and just by noticing their surroundings, what sets a true professional apart?
That's the thing. Like, I think the lines are becoming blurred. What is professional? What is photography? What is content? What is, a lot of the things that I, as a photojournalist, want to get to right now that I can't because of access, because of something is happening too quick, right? I want to capture something newsworthy, I can't get to, and maybe citizen journalists are capturing it, with their phone. And who's to say that's not professional? I mean, it's not professional, right? In the traditional sense, but it's just as valid. Everybody's perspective is valid, right? We have to come to terms with that, And so I think the professional photojournalist, photographer, you're having to strive for something different. And you maybe having to reflect more, maybe it's doing the work that maybe a person with the phone on the street capturing something that's newsworthy won't do, right? It's taking the days, weeks, months, years, right, to capture and frame something that's maybe more reflective. Maybe that's what is professional. But it's all valid. It's all just part of a conversation. Does it make me professional that I'm making a book? I don't know. It's all the lines are being blurred, right? It's amazing actually what people can do with phones. I have sworn against using phones, and I recently was working on something where I had to use a phone, and I was amazed with the results. I was like, oh my God. And it actually, at first I was really angry about it, because I was like, why is this so good? Like, but I have the professional cameras and I have these tools that are dedicated for photography. And then I had this kind of like liberating thought after it was gnawing me for days. And I was like, wait a second, who, who gives a shit? Like, it's just a tool. It's literally just a tool, and it's how you use it, you know?
Absolutely. Okay, last one for me before we actually shift gears. And how do you feel when your work is politicized in ways you didn't really predict? I'll cite an example. Say you are shooting at a MAGA protest just to document what's happening on assignment or otherwise, and someone mistakes you for a MAGA supporter. How do you feel when that happens? Is that something you take into account?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I feel like we're living in culture wars right now. That's the biggest war of the world, is optics and culture. I mean, to answer your question, like, I don't know how my work's going to be used, right? I'm going to make it. It's going to be put out in the world. And the other day I did an assignment, a political assignment, or I was following like a streamer. And a few days later, a friend sent me a picture and it was a meme. It was turned into a meme, the photograph that ran, and the person was photoshopped and made smaller, and the other person, I have no control over it, you know? And it becomes this weird cultural like conversation. And that happens to a lot of people, and I can't go after them. I mean, I guess I could, but it's happening all the time. How do you go after everybody? You know, I don't ultimately know how the work's going to be seen. I mean, I'll give you an example, right? Like the images, I wasn't there, but the images of Donald Trump, the near assassination, right? Incredible photojournalistic images that colleagues of mine take, you know, powerful work, brave, momentous, like historically so important in terms of visual record, right? But you don't know how those pictures necessarily will be used, right? By this side or that side, right? I mean, I was at the Republican National Convention, for example, 2024, so before the election, right? And on the teleprompter on the night that Donald Trump spoke, you know, they used images from the near assassination from the news outlets. How do you control where your work is going to be or how it's going to be? You can only just make it, and then what happens after, it's almost out of your hands these days, sadly, because, you know, so I guess the job is just make the work, right? Like, hope that it's creates a record, right? And then how it's used and becomes instant conversation, cultural conversations. It's very difficult, you know. Also you got to also you have to remember, like, we're talking about photojournalism, right? Like, I've worked like mostly only like newspapers and magazines throughout my career, right? Some people work for wire agencies, Reuters, Associated Press, Getty Images, et cetera, right? Agence France Presse. Yeah, Reuters. So those are news agencies, right? But they also are a wire, right? And so they syndicate all over the world to anybody who has subscriptions, right? So anybody can almost license those pictures and use them as stock imagery or for a story, right? By paying, because they can pay for the particular picture, or they can pay for a subscription and pull from that wire, right? And so if you think about it on that level too, it's like the images, all the images today are almost like up for grabs.
Yeah.
Yes.
It happened with the video of the Italian mayors during the first lockdown. It became a viral meme in Japan because Reuters subtitled it and it went on Japanese news outlets and it became a meme. It got trending on Twitter. It
Right.
can happen to any kind of
Yeah.
image.
Yeah. Or a newspaper could take that image and pay for it, or, you know, maybe some other entity and buy a commercial license and use it. And so you almost don't know, you know, where those images are going to end up. You know, my work is not on the wires, so It's not, it doesn't get used in that way, but people do reach out for relicensing pictures, or they can images can also be stolen. Yeah.
In any ways. Yeah, especially today. Absolutely. Mark, I want to light up the mood a little bit. And I want to actually change gears, as we always say. And I want to talk about the book, Cue the Birds. And my very first question would be, could you tell us the story behind the title for this limited edition book? I'm pretty sure everybody's very, very curious to know where it came from, why. Tell us about it.
It's a funny story. Cue the Birds. It literally came from the most important day of my life, which is the day I got married.
Love it. Yes.
It came out of nowhere. My wife and I, she's also a photojournalist, and we were getting married actually last year. And we were getting married in kind of a remote area in the desert, and we love deserts. In that area, we were getting married with some friends there and family. And in that area, as we were about to get married, someone noticed that there were 22 egrets flying behind us. And apparently there was no, that area doesn't see those birds. They're very magical birds. And apparently that area never sees those kinds of birds there. And all of a sudden they appeared when we were getting married. And somebody asked somebody like, "Oh, wow, did you see those birds? I wonder how much they paid for those birds." Thinking that we had actually hired these birds for our wedding. And then someone literally said to them, "Cue the birds."
Literally. And there you go.
I was talking to my wife about what they said, and I wrote it down immediately. I didn't know it would be for the book, but I was like, "Cue the birds." It's like it all made sense.
It does. It definitely does. So then, Mark, would you like to send a message, or more could you share with the audience what do you want to convey with the images that will be in the book and with Cue the Birds and the concept that you have envisioned with this edition?
I mean, what I love about working on this book and this project with you guys is that I get to pull images that from archives and from assignments and personal work that may never see the light of day. And so often doing photojournalistic reportage work, images might have to be more literal, right? When they're run, they might have to edit, the way things are presented might have to be tied to words and very particular to a story. And this is a very liberating experience because it's more about a book about how pictures talk to each other. It's so much just about the visuals, right? Like, they don't have to be from the same story. They can be from completely different time periods. It's literally just about the pictures, the photographs having a conversation. That's actually the way Ed put it when we were talking. He was like, how do pictures converse? That's something that he's amazing at. And I respect him so much for, is that he's so amazing at figuring out how to put images in conversation with each other. So it's a new kind of exercise for me. And in relation to Cue the Birds, it's about the performance of life. But it's also about scenes appearing, right? And then about something being off, maybe, and complicating the frame. It's like, here's a scene that appears, but here's this other element that maybe finds its way into the scene that is a juxtaposition or is not really supposed to be there. So what's off?
Okay, interesting. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. So we're done with the first part, the boring part, like that. So Mark, again, thank you for being with us. We hope you had fun, that you felt comfortable as well, as much as we did. And thank you truly again.
Thank you, Mark, for being with us today. And so we'll see you very, very soon in part 2. So, welcome back, everyone, to the Eyeshot Unfiltered part of our interview with Mark. For anybody watching for the first time, it's going to consist in two distinct sections, a series of rapid-fire questions and a game of this or that, because everybody loves a this or that. So, ready whenever you all are?
Exactly. So, Mark,
All right.
don't overthink it. Whatever comes to your mind. Okay?
Okay.
Get your engines going.
3 words to describe yourself.
Obsessive. Circus. Bubbles.
Right. And if you had to describe your photography with one word, which word would you choose?
Structured chaos.
To the young Mark starting out, what would you say to yourself?
Don't take yourself so seriously.
What makes you shoot faster, adrenaline or fear?
Fear.
What's worse, losing a photo or losing someone's trust?
And someone's trust. I mean, in the moment, the photo, but ultimately the trust.
What annoys you the most about the contemporary photography scene?
Instagram.
The worst advice you've ever received?
The worst advice was shoot with a 16mm lens.
Okay.
Was your first paycheck higher or lower than your expectation?
Absolutely lower.
That's totally fair. Have you ever cried for a photograph?
Yes.
What's the one piece of gear that you'd never give up?
A 35mm lens.
3 icons that have inspired your photography.
Jason Eskenazi, John Lowenstein, Carol Guzzi, and a fourth one, Isadora Kosofsky.
We loved it.
So cute,
We
Isadora.
Yes.
Love.
That was 4, sorry, but I got a bonus. I get a bonus.
Yes, you get a bonus
you
for
always-
There's
Isadora.
always a bonus
Oh.
round.
Yes.
Exactly. If you weren't a photographer, who would you be today?
I would be an expert gluten-free pizza maker.
All right. Could you elaborate on this?
I love pizza. I've been gluten-free half my life, not by choice. It sounds awesome to make. I mean, who doesn't love a delicious gluten-free pizza? Actually, I had the best gluten-free pizza in Rome when I hung out with you guys.
Okay. Have you ever risked too much for a shot?
Yeah, I've come close.
What really grinds your gears in photojournalism?
Drama.
Yes. What's the biggest fear in the field? In your field?
I think my biggest fear is like not getting it right.
Yeah. What's one of your guilty pleasures as a photographer? So something that is usually considered a mistake, but that you like in your aesthetics.
Cropping people at the edges in maybe strange ways, like crops that maybe aren't traditional, in camera,
In camera,
like as I'm shooting.
as you're shooting, not in post production.
Correct.
Okay. If you could travel back in time to whatever era you want to, which era would you photograph?
1600s, Eastern Europe.
Interesting.
Okay. If you could relive one day from your career, which day would you pick?
If I could relive one day in my career, it would be, I think it was making that photograph from the cover. Yeah. It was a moment that I remember really quite vividly because something clicked. Like it was a new way of making pictures about. Yeah, there was like a fire that happened.
3 movies every photographer should watch.
3 movies that every photographer should watch. Barney's Big Adventures. No,
I think you should keep that.
yeah, Barney's Big Adventures. No, Gamora.
Okay.
Gamora, the show.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's not, well,
It-
you're
it
asking movies. So,
counts. No, it
yeah,
counts. It counts.
the show and both the show and the movies.
Mhm.
Exquisite and Ciudad de Dios.
Yeah. Okay. If Cue the Birds were a door, where would it lead?
Into a fuzzy portal.
Very last one, Mark. What do you believe in?
I believe that we can all, even because of our differences, find ways to connect to one another. If we really like take the time and try.
Okay, beautiful.
Beautiful.
Beautifully said. Mark, last game, and then you're free to go. Okay, very, very free to go.
I'm loving these games. Let's keep it.
You like this game?
all day.
All day long. Okay, so this or that. I'll give you names of photography icons. You need to pick one, and then you'll stick with that one until you switch. Simple as that. Okay? So Dorothea Lange or Lewis Hine? Lewis Hine.
Dorothea Lange.
Dorothea Lange or Robert Capa?
Robert Capa.
Robert Capa or Don McCullin?
Don McCullin.
Don McCullin or Margaret Burke-White?
Don McCullin.
Okay. Don McCullin or Sebastião Salgado?
Sebastião Salgado.
Okay. Sebastião Salgado or Eve Arnold? I'm switching times, I'm just going back and forth.
Sebastião Salgado.
Okay. Salgado or James Nachtwey?
James Nachtwey.
James Nachtwey or Gordon Parks?
James Nachtwey.
Then I guess we have a winner, and you got James Nachtwey until the end. That's it. Thank you, Mark.
That's the game. That's the game.
Yes, exactly. So we know that this or that ends with this. So, Mark, once again, thank you so much for being with us, for the questions, for all this time together, and for playing with us as well. So, thank you.
Well, thank you guys for taking the time, and it was difficult and fun. Yeah, I enjoyed that.
Thank you, Mark, for being with us today. So before we say bye to everyone, I would like to leave another small message to all of our viewers. So thanks for watching. Thanks for staying with us, and keep supporting Eyeshot, because by supporting Eyeshot, you're supporting independent street photography, independent publishing, and made in Italy arts and craftsmanship. So keep the likes going, keep the comments coming, and subscribe. So thank you, Mark. Cue the Birds will be available for pre-orders until December 31st. So think about it for a Christmas present. And we'll see you in the next episode. And bye.